you don't think it's not too much.
I know. Don't think about it. Just do it.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started tonight. A few announcements. I think will get the ball rolling for us this evening. Ooh, gotta get back to. Oh, is this the regular announcement set, Steve? Okay, all right. So we got our Bible studies on Tuesday mornings for the men and for the ladies. If you've got time, it's a great little get together. I think do the ladies go for a bite afterwards or just the guys? Ladies do, so together kind of thing? Okay. So if you can stay a little bit later and they grab some food afterwards. So okay. Well that goes back to the old days when it used to be. Well, I mean like the days well, yeah, it's all a change of faces. Nobody that was in that group is in this group anymore. So I'm talking about a group that's, even before your time. So that used to be the original location for all of the, what's that? Yep, if you have to. Yeah, yeah. That is our business of the month. So if you go to Central Park, just a couple more days, we'll have a new business for you on Sunday for the month of April. But if you go there, leave one of those cards that explains to them what we're trying to do as a church to help the locally owned small businesses in our community. Wana is on Sunday nights, and it's not Tiny Night. That was last week. Just a small change we're going to make for the upcoming week. My wife is the only one who got that. But anyway, no, it's not Tiny Night anymore. We're making a small change. So anyway, lady, it doesn't count when you guys laugh that late. The ladies' fellowship, that's our third Tuesday of every month. So it's a good time for the ladies to get together and have a Bible study, have some snacks and some fellowship. We had our fellowship meal last Sunday. It was great. The ladies' conference is tomorrow through Saturday. So all day each of those days. There's still some information out in the Welcome Center if you need it. It is not too late to invite other ladies to come and be a part of that. So going to be a good conference, all going to be live streamed right here. So it's convenient, it's affordable, and there will be food. Tough to beat, yeah. So again, not too late to invite some ladies if you would like to do that starting tomorrow. Again, any or all of the conference. I mean, whatever they can make it to, it would be beneficial for sure. Good Friday service is at 7 o'clock on Friday. Sometimes, when people call and ask, what day is your Good Friday service? Well, we tell them that it's on Friday. But 7 o'clock, so 7 p.m., then roll out of bed a little bit earlier, or get here, I would say, a little bit earlier, 7 a.m. for the sunrise service on Easter Sunday. Pancake breakfast is at 8. Morning service is at 9:45. We are doing baptisms during the morning service, which will be great. I think we've got 4 people lined up so far. Might have a few more to add to that number. And we will do Sunday school on Easter Sunday, and then the rest of the day belongs to you. No Awana on Easter Sunday. So as we said, rest of the day is for you to spend with family, friends, that sort of thing. Yep, already talked about that. If you're interested in joining with the baptisms, you just need to talk to me, and we'll make sure that you can be a part of that. And that brings us to our study for tonight. So let's have a word of prayer, and we'll get into Hosea chapter 8. God, as we come before you, grateful for your power, grateful for your sovereignty, grateful for your compassion and your love as we look at your people in the book of Hosea. It's not a good scene. God, it's just something that is going to be it's a measure of discipline because of their sin, because they've turned from you. Lord, and we'll see tonight, it is certainly to a point of no return, broken just beyond repair. So I pray that you would help us to see, just for ourselves, some things that we can pick up and some things that we can learn as we see their poor behavior, God, and what they've chosen to do. We thank you that your word is living, and that, again, today we can gain as much as when it was originally written. So help us to be attentive. We pray for the teens and the leaders over there as they work together tonight. I just ask that you will use the leaders in a great way, use your truth and your word to challenge the hearts of the teens as well. Help us in all things, God, to glorify you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty. Hosea chapter 8. Hosea chapter 8, if you can turn there. We're in a section of the book of Hosea. We kind of started out with Hosea looking at, it was kind of more of a narrative, kind of a historical narrative. God, again, uses Hosea as the example of himself. So we're talking about an ever-faithful God. It's how God shows his faithfulness to his people. He uses the illustration of Hosea marrying a wife. Her name is Gomer. And through that marriage, Gomer eventually leaves him. Well, they have children. She leaves him to basically prostitute herself. And then God calls Hosea or instructs Hosea to go and to buy her back, which kind of tells us that she was actually a slave prostitute. So he buys her back. And the picture there is of God who chose his people from the beginning, God who called them to be, in that sense, his bride. And he made, well, if you will, had children, made a great nation of them, right? And they decided that they were going to go after other gods. They were going to commit spiritual adultery. And even when they did that, God was going to buy them back. He was going to be faithful to them. So this whole account here is to represent God's faithfulness. This middle section that we're in right now of Hosea is really where God is kind of laying out all the charges against his people and giving all kinds of illustrations. We looked at a bunch of illustrations last week. We'll see a few more this week. He's just making it abundantly clear that when he is disciplining his people, when he's bringing this judgment on them, because again, this is a final judgment for the northern kingdom. They will be no more. Okay, by the time Israel comes back full circle, they'll be taken off into exile. The southern kingdom will be taken into exile in Babylon, and then they'll come back, and no more do we have a divided kingdom. So this northern kingdom and the people of the northern kingdom, the closest we get to ever kind of seeing them around again will be in the form of Samaritans. When we get into Jesus' time, they're kind of like the half-breed Jews, and there's a huge rivalry between the Jews and the Samaritans, and they hate each other. We kind of know how that works as we look into the New Testament. A few background things here for the book of Hosea. We've kind of looked at these each week, so we'll just review them again. Hosea means salvation. He is a pre-exilic prophet from 755 to about 710 BC, the last prophet of Israel to the northern kingdom before her fall to Assyria. Prophesied at a time of physical prosperity, yet spiritual bankruptcy. We'll see a little bit of that physical prosperity in their efforts to stubbornly build their own life, build their own culture, build their own kingdom, if you will, without God's help. The marriage between Hosea and Gomer, again, visually illustrates God's relationship with his people, and Hosea demonstrates the unfailing covenant love that God has for his people. Look with me at Hosea chapter 8, and we'll begin in verse 1. Set the trumpet on your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. To me they cry, my God, we, Israel, know you. Israel has spurned the good, the enemy shall pursue him. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. I have spurned your calf, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For it is from Israel a craftsman made it. It is not God. The calf of Samaria shall be broken to pieces. For they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads, it shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it. Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations as a useless vessel. For they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Though they hire allies among the nations, I will soon gather them up, and the king and princes shall soon writhe because of tribute. Because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, they have become to him altars for sinning. Were I to write for him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. As for my sacrificial offerings, they sacrifice meat and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. For Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. So I will send fire upon his cities, and it shall devour her strongholds. We are looking tonight at broken beyond repair. And that's what God describes here in Hosea chapter 8 is the brokenness of Israel. You know, we talk a lot about brokenness in church today. And when we talk about brokenness, we kind of talk about maybe a brokenness of maybe contrition, right? Where a person has come to a point where they are broken and they're ready to turn to God. And this is not that. Rest assured, this is a brokenness beyond repair. This is not a group of people, I think you could pick that up as we read through. This is not a group of people that is looking to turn back to God. They're not a group that's saying, hey, we've sinned, we've done so many wrong things, we're broken. God, we're undeserving of your mercy and undeserving of your grace. No, these people are saying, hey, let's just keep going. Let's just keep, they're broken, and there's a sense maybe that they don't know just how badly broken they are. But again, it's going to be beyond repair. So that's what we'll look at tonight. We're going to see, first of all, in what ways Israel has been broken beyond repair. And at the end, we'll try to find some parallels or find some applications for us. And maybe more generally, kind of the church today. What are some things that we can learn from Israel that will be helpful to us as not just Suncoast Baptist Church, but the church in general. So in what ways has she been broken beyond repair? First of all, she's been broken in battle. She's been broken in battle. Look at how he begins there. Set the trumpet to your lips. The trumpet blows, it's the sound of battle, right? It's the battle cry. Hey, war is about to start. The battle is about to begin. But if you notice the very next statement, it almost makes the first phrase seem out of place, right? Set the trumpet to your lips. There's a vulture that's over the house of the Lord. The trumpet is the start of the battle. The vultures come up to clean the mess, right? They come to clean the mess afterwards, the leftovers, if you will, from the battle. In other words, it's going to happen pretty quick. This isn't like an option. This isn't, well, maybe it'll be. No, this is, the battle is going to happen, and it's going to be swift, and the vultures are already here. In other words, Israel as a nation, the vulture over the house of the Lord, that would be the corpse that the vultures are going to feast off of. Is a fallen Israel. They will be broken in battle. You can see in verse 3, the enemy shall pursue him. Why is that? Why are they going to be broken in battle? Well, in verse 2, they say, my God, we, Israel, know you. Well, congratulations. They said they know God, but what did their actions say? What did their deeds say? What have they done? He says, well, they, in verse 1, have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. Well, they say they love me, they say they know me, but they don't obey, right? They don't do what I've instructed them to do. So they've transgressed God's covenant. They don't keep his covenant. They rebel against God's law. And in verse 3, Israel has spurned the good. They have despised the good of God by despising his covenant, by not keeping his law. And so they're going to be broken in battle. One of the things that we'll see kind of throughout this chapter is that every effort that Israel makes to kind of make their lives better or to do something that they think is beneficial to them only makes them weaker and worse off. And that's going to be seen because they're going to be destroyed very quickly in battle. We also see that they're broken in worship. They're broken in worship. Verse 5 is just talking about the worship of the people, you know, with they make idols with their silver and gold. But look at what God says here. He says, I have spurned your calf, O Samaria. Remember the calf of Samaria. This is one of the places where they set up, where Jeroboam set up idol worship in the northern kingdom so that those of the northern kingdom didn't have to go down to the southern kingdom to Jerusalem to worship. Well, the big problem with that is that God's the one who said, you're supposed to worship in Jerusalem at the temple. So they set up essentially, although they said they were going to worship God at these same places, these places where these idols were set up, they are not worshiping God the way God said he wanted to be worshiped, and so they're worshiping falsely. So it's idolatrous worship, and God says, I spurn your idols. He goes on there, he says his anger burns against them. It's a powerful phrase. How long will they be incapable of innocence? This is the extent of their wickedness. We, generally speaking, we like to say, well, you know, there's a little bit of good in everyone. You know, everybody's capable of doing something good. And there are, you know, I think some people, you know, where there's, you know, we're going to do some good things and some bad things. We all have seen throughout history that there are some people that really all they do is bad, right? It's evil, it's wicked, it's hurtful. And again, that's driven by selfishness. It's driven by the pride and the desire of the heart that they're after just to fulfill their own desire. But that's the problem here is that Israel, and that's why we're saying, again, beyond repair. They're broken beyond repair because they are so far gone in their wickedness, they're incapable of doing something innocent. They're incapable of doing something that is good. You might even think back to the days of Noah, right? Where the thoughts of the intents of the heart were only evil continually, you know? But that's the case for the northern kingdom at this particular point. And God says their idols will be broken. These false gods that they worship, they're going to be broken. Ultimately, that's what's going to happen. And so their whole system of worship is broken. But again, we say, well, why? Why is their worship broken? If you go back to verse 4, they made kings, here's the phrase, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. Well, does that mean that God didn't know what Israel was doing? Of course not. He's just saying that they didn't consult me when they did what? When they set up their kings and when they set up their princes. When they established their leadership, they did not look to God. Now, the united kingdom of Israel from its beginning made that mistake with Saul. They didn't really, you know, this was well, it was the man of the people, right? And so now the northern kingdom, what they're doing is they are setting up these leaders, and what we see very consistently is that as the leaders go, so goes the nation. And most specifically, spiritually speaking, when there's a good king, well, there's no good kings in the north, so the northern kingdom, I'm not talking like anyway, there's a lot of parallels we could draw there. But anyway, we go back to, in the southern kingdom, there was a few good kings in the southern kingdom. And when those good kings took the throne, guess what everybody did? Everybody worshiped the Lord, and they were faithful to follow God. But then when the next king came along and he wanted to go back to the idol worship and worshiping Baals, then guess what everybody did? Everybody followed the leadership of the king. And so this is one of those indictments against the people, is that they've set up their own leadership, and it's ungodly leaders that were leading them into this idolatrous worship. I mean, who got this ball rolling, right? It was Jeroboam. He set up, the first king that they established for the northern kingdom is the one who set up this idolatrous worship. And so as we think today, I mean, this would be one of those notes for churches today, right? Be careful who you set up in leadership in churches. There's unfortunately so many today that, churches are putting people, and quite honestly, they're putting ungodly people, and I'm not necessarily saying unsaved people, I won't go to that extent, but they're putting ungodly, unqualified people in positions of leadership sometimes because they're famous and they're going to draw a crowd. Sometimes maybe they have a certain skill in the business world that's going to be beneficial to the financial growth and prosperity of the church. But the problem is that if a leader, especially a spiritual leader, is not a godly leader, they can't lead the people and the church in a godly direction. And so churches have to be very careful who they put in that position of leadership especially. But look at verse 4. They made idols for themselves, so that's kind of a bad idea to begin with, right? With their silver and their gold, they made idols for their own destruction, kind of didn't realize they were sabotaging themselves in that process. And that idea of idols for themselves, we might say just gods to suit themselves, whatever they wanted to worship. They weren't interested in, hey, how does God want to be worshiped, or what does God want to be worshiped as? Because, of course, we know that God is a spirit. Those who worship him worship in spirit and in truth. They said, well, hey, what do we want to worship? What do we want to represent the God that we worship? So they were making their own idols and their own gods. Again, incapable of innocence. So this is one reason why their worship failed, is that there has to be again, a humility. There has to be a contrition. There has to be, as we come to God to worship, we can't just do our own thing or hold on to our sin and then come and think that God is going to be worshiped by us. So they were incapable of innocence. And in verse 6, what they're doing is worshiping. He says the craftsman, he says it's from Israel. A craftsman made it. These gods and these images, these are made by a craftsman. These don't come from God, and they're going to be broken into pieces. So their worship is broken as well. We see next that they are a broken vessel. They are a broken vessel. If you look there into these verses, how are they broken? It says that they sow the wind, right? They sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. You probably heard that phrase before. Somebody's used it. To sow the wind, what do you get when you sow the wind? And don't say the whirlwind, because that's part of God's illustration. What? Right. I mean, can you sow the wind? I mean, you can't, right? So there's sowing emptiness, but here's the problem. It's not just resulting in emptiness. They're sowing emptiness, and the result is actually going to be damaging and destructive. I would have you think along the lines of they're very, maybe we'll use a term, they're very nonchalant about worship. Kind of, if we do, we do. If we don't, we don't. They're nonchalant about their own standing before God and their own usefulness before God. They don't really care that they are God's chosen people. They don't really care that God has called them out to be used for a specific purpose. And because they don't care, they're not really sowing anything of value. But the problem is they're going to reap the whirlwind. They're going to reap great destruction in all of this. He says they're like grain without heads. If you have a stalk of grain that grows up and you have the stalk but you have no head on it, you're going to say this thing is broken, right? It's broken. It's not working properly. And so they're a stalk without any head on it. There is no produce, no fruit. There should be, but there's not. They are going to be swallowed up. If you look at verse 8, he says, Israel is swallowed up. They are among the nations as a useless vessel. A useless vessel. How are they swallowed up? Well, what Israel had done is they had decided, you know what, we're going to go and we're going to try to blend in, right? We're going to try to look like everybody else. We're going to try to fit in with everybody else. We're going to take advantage of all the different things that everybody else has to offer. And in that process, you might say Israel just became unnoticeable as God's chosen people. They no longer stood out. They no longer were unique, we might say, in that case or in that sense. Why is this? Well, if you look at verse 9, it says that they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. One of the reasons that they're a broken vessel is because they sought help from Assyria. They looked for help from Assyria, and that was basically weakening them. What they thought was going to strengthen them was actually weakening them. Excuse me. Oh, just lost that. Just needed tissues. There was none on the front pew. I thought they were on the front pew, but there's none there. Okay, but anyway, so they sought help from Assyria, and this wandering donkey illustration. Again, there's lots of illustrations that God gives because the people would understand it. The wild donkey, kind of an isolated creature, kind of likes roaming about on its own, and stubbornness is another part of that picture. The stubbornness to just go after help from Assyria when they could just be getting help from God, who was already right there, but they're wild again. Remember that idea that they're not tame, they're not going to stay where they're supposed to be. They're a wild donkey. They sought other lovers. And you could think of this as, of course, the spiritual illustration that God's been giving all along with the spiritual adultery. But this is going to include also physical. In other words, the intermarrying of the northern kingdom with the other nations that are around them. The more mingled they become with the nations around them, the less they look like Israel. And the less they are putting their trust in God, the less they really are the people of God. And so what is that doing to them? Well, it's weakening them at every point. And so that's why they're going to be this useless vessel in verse 8, a useless vessel, a broken vessel, and ultimately, all of these attempts, if you look at verse 10, they sought allies among the nations. Well, what's going to happen as a result of that? They're going to be crushed under tribute. In other words, they're going to go and say, hey, Assyria, give us some help. And Assyria will say, all right, we'll give you some help for a price. Well, ultimately, the price is going to be more than they can possibly bear. And so this strategy, which the strategy is to not trust God. That's their problem. They're not going to trust God, and so it's going to backfire on them. One more thing here that we see in their brokenness is that they are broken but still building. Okay, they're broken but still building. Like I said, we're in a moment, we're going to look back through all of these, and we're going to kind of see a little bit of our application for us. But they're broken and still building. This is about their stubbornness, really. Verse 11, Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning. It's one thing to have an altar to a false god. It's a different thing altogether to have another one, and then a bunch more and a bunch more. And that's what they're doing. They are multiplying these altars for sinning. God is going to punish them. Let's kind of skip to verse 13 to start off with. God does not accept them. So again, we're talking a little bit more about worship here. God is not accepting of their offerings. God will return them to bondage. Egypt, in verse 13, when he says they shall return to Egypt, they did go and look for help from Egypt. They kind of bounced back and forth. The northern kingdom bounced back and forth between Assyria and Egypt. When Assyria was giving them a hard time, they asked for help from Egypt. When Egypt was giving them a hard time, they'd ask for help for the northern kingdom, or from Assyria. Interesting thing all the while is that no matter who was after the northern kingdom, they kind of ran all over the southern kingdom. So the southern kingdom had to deal with it as well. But this isn't saying they're necessarily going to go back down to Egypt. Egypt's just being used here as the symbol of slavery, right? That's every time you would talk about Egypt to an Israelite, to a Jew, that's what they think about, is that slavery in Egypt. And so that's all God is saying. You're going to be back in a position of slavery as you were in Egypt. And there's ultimately going to be a great destruction. I'm good, thank you. There's ultimately going to be a great destruction that comes in verse 14. God says, I will send fire upon its cities, and it will devour the strongholds. So they're broken. Yeah, they're building things. They're building altars. They're building cities. But it's already broken. It's broken before they build it. And again, in their stubbornness and saying that they're not going to turn to God, they keep persisting. Now, again, they're multiplying these altars for sinning. Why are they broken but still building? Is because they're multiplying these altars for sinning. And they themselves, he says in verse 11, they have become to him altars for sinning. It's not just God's people worshiping at these altars anymore. It's essentially God's people might as well be these altars. They are altars for sinning. Their very lives, their very being, what they're doing, they are an altar for sinning. Verse 12, God says, if I wrote them 10,000 laws, it'd be hard to miss, right? If there was 10,000 of them. He says if I did that, they would be regarded as a strange thing. It doesn't matter. God is saying it doesn't matter what instruction I give to my people, to the northern kingdom. They've made up their mind. They're not going to obey. I could have 10,000 laws, and they're not going to obey. So ultimately they've become indifferent to God's laws. They multiply sacrifices, but they're unacceptable to God. If you look at verse 13, lots and lots of sacrifices. They multiply the sacrifices, but again, they're unacceptable to God. They sacrifice meat and they eat it. That's wonderful for them. But he says in verse 13, but the Lord does not accept them. Into verse 14, they have forgotten their maker. Normally, God's the one who promised them. As they went into the promised land, he promised them success. Right? He promised that he would basically drive their enemies out before them. He promised them that they would have these cities that they didn't have to build, houses that they didn't have to build, crops and fields and vineyards that they didn't have to plant. God gave them all of these things, but they forgot God. but they're still pursuing, right? They're still going after this stuff. They want to build palaces, right? They want to multiply their fortified cities. What are they thinking? They're thinking, well, if we can build something big enough, then we can take care of ourselves. Interesting thing about how God works is that God never intends for his people to take care of themselves. You know, the old classic, God helps those who help themselves. Guess what's not in the Bible? Guess what's not biblical thinking? Okay? That is self-thinking. That is, hey, I'm very important. I need to do this. Now, God's word says a lot about people being diligent and hard workers, and I think there's some of that sentiment in that phrase, but do not ever let someone tell you, somewhere in there, I know it says God helps those who help themselves. No, it doesn't. What they needed to be doing, and this is where the strategy was off, and it was off because of their sinfulness. The strategy should have been, God's the one who put us here, so God's the one we need to look to. Last week, remember, we saw that one of the illustrations was the dove that flew from the nest, right? They should have stayed in the nest. They were safe in the nest because the nest is the one that God made for them. The place that God put them is where God had them, so they should have trusted God, but they didn't. And so Israel is trying to multiply their palaces. They're trying to multiply their fortified cities, but quite honestly, to no avail. I'm going to go ahead and, let's see. Yeah, I can put this up there for you right now because we're going to talk about, but this verse here, Psalm 127, verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. These people, the northern kingdom, was building their cities, building their kingdoms, trying to take care of themselves, not trusting God to watch over them. And God is simply saying to them, vanity. It's a waste. Because he says, I'll send fire upon the cities. It will devour her strongholds. Nothing they could do was going to hold back God's judgment because of their wickedness. And that's the issue for them. So how do we see this for us? How do we maybe make our application for us today? We go back to broken in battle. I'm going to flip back here just so that you can see these again if you didn't get to write them down. To be broken in battle, here was their issue was they said that they were on God's side, but really they're not on God's side. It's not enough to know who God is, right? It's not enough to just know who God is, to know God exists. We need to be on God's side. Just claiming his name doesn't mean that we're on his side. Really, it's the actions and the obedience that shows allegiance to God. The second part is that they're broken in worship. They decided to worship in their own way, right? Ungodly leaders who led them into idolatry. The church, I mentioned this earlier, the church in America needs to take heed who they put in positions of leadership. We have so many in positions of leadership in churches today that are basically leading their churches in, I would say, into the idolatry of things like LGBTQ ideologies, things that we would just simply in bulk refer to as woke ideologies, and some of the progressive movements in churches. Those are the kinds of things that leaders of churches are leading their people to. And to be quite honest, most people in those churches simply go that route and agree with those premises or those ideologies because, well, the guy at the front, well, nowadays, or the girl at the front, is saying that this is okay and that this is what we should do. As the leadership goes, a lot of times, so goes the people. And so we have to be careful about who is in that position of leadership. Not that, again, not that people can't fall or sin and be restored, forgiven, and those sorts of things, but there should be a measure of caution. I guess we'll name a name here. Anyway, Carl Lentz is the guy who is the pastor or the head guy at the Hillsong Church in New York City. He was removed from that position because of multiple extramarital affairs that he had. He has just recently been called to the pastoral staff of an extremely large megachurch in Kansas. And, you know, and so we say, why? Okay, because this isn't actually too far from the time he was removed from his other leadership position. We should say things like, are there sufficient evidences or examples of, some kind of change that's been made? Are we really seeing something different here? Or are we just saying, you know what, this guy did a great job of making that church really big. So maybe he can make our really big church really bigger. Yes, poor grammar, right? Or this guy has some expertise in this area, and I know he did this, but we're not going to worry about that because he can help us in this way or in that way. We have to be extremely careful about those things. I guess maybe it's one thing if you're running a business, okay? And if you're a Christian running a business, you should be cautious as well. But it's a different thing altogether when we're talking about the church. Because what people, again, naturally and most often do is they just say, well, whatever that guy up at the front is saying, it must be true because that's what we're paying him to do, right? And sadly, the churches are putting a lot of people in those positions that should not be there. It's really an idolatry of self-worship that's being promoted in a lot of churches today, and we need to be cautious of that. Being broken vessels. Again, Israel was broken and useless because they were scattered among a pagan culture. Rather than remaining intact, rather than remaining that vessel that God had made them to be from the beginning, they were trying to maybe you might visualize that as they were trying to add on other pieces. They were trying to make their vessel larger by adding other pieces that didn't belong there. And unfortunately, what that does is that if you break something and then you try to glue it back together, it's weaker than it was to start with. And so they weaken themselves. And we have to be cautious in the church today to remain vessels that are holy and pure, that are fit for the master's use. And that's what Paul says to Timothy. He says, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work. And then lastly, broken but still building. Again, Israel stubbornly tried to ensure their survival without seeking help from God. How can we build it bigger? How can we build it stronger? And then we don't really need God anymore. All the efforts that we can make to build our lives on our principles or on our foundation or on our way of doing things is ultimately going to fall apart. When Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, the test by fire, I mean, boom, it goes up quick. If it's not the right kind of building materials on the right foundation. And so we have to be careful not to be building our lives in our own way. We need to really be building with God's help, trusting Him, as this verse here tells us, right? To watch the city and to build the house. That's what we need to be looking for. Okay? Questions, comments, thoughts? Anybody at all? All right. We'll end the live stream so they don't have to see me blow my nose again.